Good evening, everybody, and I hope that everybody's doing great. I hope that you are preparing well for Rosh Hashanah and all that good stuff. I apologize for being slightly delayed. Some people wait to get that weekly reminder email, and for some reason Zoom was not letting me send it. I tried several times in the past half an hour. Some people may have gotten it, some people didn't. I apologize if you didn't get it, if you usually need it. But be it as it may, we are ready to begin now. And one way or the other, people either got the link and will sign in, or will eventually figure it out. By the way, Nomi, can you send my parents the link? They can't get in. I just got a text from them. Maybe we got to figure out something besides Zoom, because it's whatever. Anyhow, or maybe we'll just drop the link altogether and make it easier for people to get in. I don't know. We'll figure out something. But be it as it may, we are ready to rock and roll. Give me one more second to turn on this camera. And let's do it. So we are now back for the 19th installment of the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. And it's a very enigmatic discussion tonight about the enigmatic ending of the Northern Kingdom and the quote unquote 10 lost tribes, what that means, where they went, if we'll see them again, etc., etc., etc. So that is all the fun stuff we will be covering tonight. There in your chat box, you have the link for the outline if you're interested. And with no further ado, we will just delve right in. So at the end of last week's session, we told about how tumultuous the time had gotten in the First Commonwealth, how complicated, how difficult, how everything, you would think could go wrong was going wrong. And that was the situation. We had the house of Omri or Achav that had taken over not only the Northern Kingdom, but the Southern Kingdom as well through their political alliance / intermarriage. Well, that's not intermarriage of Judah, non-Judah, it's intermarriage of the two families, the family of Omri and the family of David. And that truly wreaked havoc on the Northern Kingdom. It wreaked havoc on the Southern Kingdom. It wreaked havoc everywhere. And we're going to see that the house of Omri was completely wiped out in the north and completely wiped out in the south as well. And that is essentially where our story picks up. Following the house of Omri, the new house in the north that we're going to be focusing on is the house of Yehu. And the house in the south is always the house of David, but now we have gotten rid of the element from Omri that was in the house of David. We got rid of the wicked Asaliah, and now we are starting anew. We described her grandson's reign last week, Yoash, who was for the most part righteous, unfortunately ended not so righteous when he eventually is complacent or actually complicit in the murder of his cousin, the prophet and the high priest Zechariah. That blood will boil in the temple until Nebuchadnezzar comes to destroy the temple, and which is chieftain Nebuzaradan sees the blood and wondering what it was, figures out this terrible story of the killing of Zechariah on Yom Kippur by the Jews in the temple, and he proceeds to slaughter tens of thousands of Jews trying to avenge the blood. Finally, he says, do you want me to wipe out anyone? The blood stops. Nebuzaradan was so inspired by this that he actually converts to become a Jew. Very interesting story. But that's the backdrop where we begin tonight. So in the north, we have this house of Yehu that was successful for wiping out the house of Omri. And in the south, we are back to really the back and forth of the kings, good, not so good, with the house of Judah. Now, one interesting backdrop that also connects to Yom Kippur, we're going to have a couple mentionings, seeing as this is our last session before the high holidays. So I have a couple shout outs to the high holidays. But one of the famous stories in Tanakh that also goes on during this time in the north, in other words, when Yehu is ruling, when his son Yehoachaz is ruling, that you have many great prophets. We talked about last week the story of Eliyahu Hanavi, of Elijah the prophet, and how the Almighty sent the worst of times, to the best of prophets to try and get them on the right path. And we see that just continues, that after Elijah goes to heaven in a fiery chariot, his main disciple Elisha takes over, and Elisha continues much in the way of Elijah. And we see that Elisha has a main disciple by the name of Yonah or Jonah. And yes, this is the famous Yonah/Jonah from Yom Kippur, from the fish's stomach. That is exactly the time period where we are dealing in. So when we're dealing with these wicked kings in the north, we have these great prophets trying to rectify the situation, because the Almighty just never gives up on the Jewish people until there's nothing left to hang your hat on, so to speak. And one of those great prophets is Jonah. So it's during this time that Jonah is observing all these terrible situations we've been talking about, observing the house of Omri in the north, all the idol worship in the north, Yehu coming in, wiping out the house of Omri, but ceasing to get rid of the idol worship and continuing to be an evil king himself. His son Yehoahaz takes over, also is a terrible king, and Yonah is given the job of chastising the Jewish people, because, hey, that's the job of a prophet. And as we're seeing in all these sessions, a prophet was one of the worst jobs that a Jew could possibly have, because we see what happens to the prophets when in general, what happens to people when they stand up and tell you publicly you're wrong, when they call you out. There's many great options you have nowadays, like you can refer to it as fake news, or you can refer to it as, well, Afghanistan wasn't really important. Anyways, again, depending on how you want to deal with it, that's how we deal with, when we're called out in public nowadays. But back in antiquity, what would happen to prophets? They would be killed. They would be thrown into jail. We mentioned Zechariah being killed. We're going to talk about the great Isaiah soon. Isaiah was killed. We're going to talk about Jeremiah. Jeremiah was thrown into a dungeon. It was no easy job to have being a prophet. And Yonah, even though he was given the gift of prophecy, had reached that level, he didn't want it. He didn't want to go through what his Rebbe Elisha had gone through, what his Rebbe Eliyahu had gone through. He just didn't want any of it. So he says, I'm not going to chastise the Jewish people just to be ignored. And now you're telling me to go chastise the people of Nineveh, who we're going to talk a little bit more about them throughout the session tonight. But Nineveh was the capital of the country to the north east of Israel, Aram. Nineveh was probably somewhere around modern day Damascus, and that was the kingdom of Aram, which is modern day Syria. And Yonah was told to go chastise the people of Nineveh and Aram in Syria. Yonah said, I don't want to do it. What was his reasoning? He said, because you know what? There's one or two options that are going to happen. Either they're going to listen to me or they're not going to listen to me. If they don't listen to me, they might kill me. If they do listen to me, it looks terrible for the Jewish people. Because here you've been sending all these amazing prophets to try and wake up the Jews. And here you send me, who's the least of them, he's being very humble, who's the least of them. I'm going to head up to the north, and I'm going to head up to Aram and tell them to straighten up. What if they straighten out? It'll look terrible for the Jews. So Jonah runs away. He goes on a ship. God sends a big storm. Jonah realizes the storm's because of him. They throw him overboard. He gets swallowed by a fish. It was not a whale. It was just a big fish. And he's eventually spit out by that fish. He eventually says, okay, Almighty, I get it. I got to go to Nineveh. I'm going to go. And he goes to Nineveh. He tells them to do tshuva, to stop their evil ways. They do. And that's Jonah's story. And sure enough, it is to a certain extent what we would call a kitrug. It's an argument on the Jewish people. That here, this prophet goes to Aram, and at least temporarily, they correct their ways. They heed his call. And the Jews just kill, beat up, throw into jail their prophets and don't listen to them. So it's in this time when that story of Yonah takes place. So back to the north of Israel, to the kingdom of Israel for our three-ring circus over here. So the king Yehoahaz, who takes leadership in the year 3083 on the Jewish calendar, 678 before the Common Era on the secular calendar. Just again, continues in the way, like we've said before, all the northern kings were bad, one worse than the other, some slightly better, but they were all bad. So just an example of what he does is that Aram, who we mentioned before, Aram was, that's where Nineveh was, that's where Yonah went to. So the great ruler from Aram was a man by the name of Naaman. And Naaman is struck with some sort of leprosy. Now, it's probably not tzara'as, like we talk about in the Torah, because tzara'as was a spiritual affliction, and it doesn't seem that it would happen to someone who couldn't be sensitive to the spiritual nature of it. But whatever it was, he had some sort of skin ailment. And he comes to Yehoachaz, and he says, and this, I would think that this is after Yonah had already been to his country, so he had a certain amount of inspiration from the Jewish prophets. So he says, okay, we know Jonah's great, but Elisha, he's the Rebbe. Like he's the head prophet here. I have this skin ailment. I want to meet with Elisha to be able to get healed from my skin disease that I have going on right now. Now, this poses a very serious existential problem for Yehoachaz. Why? Because, again, Yehoachaz, evil king. Elisha, prophet, trying to straighten out the king and the kingdom. What do you think their relationship was? Terrible. What do you think Yehoachaz thought of Elisha? The worst of the worst. And here you have this mighty king of Aram, Naaman, coming and saying, I want to meet with your prophet. He's going to help me out. Well, what does Yehoachaz say? He says, "Oh, great! Now I got a problem," because he thinks Elisha's he's worthless, and he thinks that Naaman's going to be with Elisha. Elisha's going to help him out. Naaman's going to kill him, wipe out the king. He doesn't know what's going to happen, so he tries to discourage him from meeting with Elisha, meeting with the prophet. He says it's not going to help you, but Naaman persists, and finally he meets Elisha. Now, Elisha, in the inimitable way of many of the prophets, he tells Naaman to go jump in the Nile River. I'm sorry, in the Jordan River. So go jump in the Jordan River. Now, Naaman thinks he's making fun of him. Like we would say, go jump in a lake. That's what Naaman thought that the prophet Elisha was saying. Like, get away from me, go jump in a lake. And Elisha won't explain himself, won't give him any more time, and he goes away. Naaman's obviously very upset, contemplating what he's going to do. At which point, one of his generals says to him, 1 second, you wanted to know what the prophet said. The prophet said, jump in the river. The leprosy you got, try jumping in the river and see what happens. Well, what's the worst thing that happens? The worst thing that happens is just swim in the Jordan River. So he goes, he jumps in the Jordan River, he comes out, and his skin ailment is healed. Of course, Naaman wants to repay the prophet Elisha for his great advice, the great kindness that he showed him, and he goes to try and shower great wealth upon Elisha. Elisha says, nope, don't want it. My job is help people out. I helped you out. More than happy to do it. Gehen gesund to hate. I don't want your money. Fine. So Naaman starts heading back to Syria, and there is a man, a student, assistant, whatever it is, of Elisha by the name of Gehazi. Now, Gehazi sees a golden opportunity, and he says, oh, well, Naaman wants to give money. Why don't I go get a little money? So he chases after Naaman. He says, my teacher, Elisha, he had a change of heart. He does want your money. He'll be happy to take it, and I'll carry it back to him. So Naaman gives all the money and wealth and jewels and whatever it was to Gehazi that he intended for Elisha. And what was not figured into the equation over here is that with the money came the leprosy. And Gehazi is struck with tzara'as, is struck with leprosy, which he has the rest of his life. And this is just one of many stories of Gehazi, who had a potential to be a great prophet, like Elisha, like Jonah, but keeps making these grave mistakes and doesn't learn from his lesson, so much so that he is one of those listed in the Talmud as somebody who has no portion in the world to come. Now, he's referenced a couple different times, especially over the holidays, when we say the Birchas Kohanim, the priestly blessing. I don't know if we have any Kohanim in the room tonight, But when we say the priestly blessing, there's these prayers that we say during the priestly blessing. One of them is for being healed from things we need to be healed from, and we actually mention this story of Gehazi and Naaman. It's mentioned in that prayer. So with this story, you can focus a little bit more on your prayers through the holidays. But that's the time period of Yehoachaz. It's again very challenging. He's threatened by Ashur. Ashur is Assyria. So we have Syria, which is Aram. That's basically modern day Syria. We have Assyria, which is in Hebrew called Ashur, which is to the north of Syria. I guess it'd be modern day, Lebanon. And actually, I'm going to bring up a picture for everyone to look at of the map, so because we're going to talk a lot about these foreign countries tonight, and it's important to have an idea geographically of where we're talking about. So let me bring this up here. So this is the map of the region during the time, and so we see here that this is the kingdom of Judah down here in the south, or what we call the southern kingdom, right? Down here, that's Judah. Okay, this is the kingdom of Israel up here, the northern kingdom up here, right? It's not that different than the borders of modern day Israel. And then over here is Aram, as we mentioned, or Syria. Ammon's not going to factor in too much. Moab isn't going to factor in too much. And Edom is not going to factor in too much, but those are some of the other neighbors. But the main neighbors we're worried about now are Assyria and Aram. So a lot of the issues the Jews are going to have in our discussion tonight are going to come from these two countries up here. Now, once we have this map open, and we'll talk more about this later, it's interesting just to point out, and you think about this map, and if you superimpose it in your mind on a map of modern day Israel, so the country ends here, right? A little bit south of Beersheba. Now, it also includes this, which is modern day Jordan, but it does not include this, which is the Gaza Strip. It's just interesting to think about that one of the areas that causes us so much trouble today is the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is not part of biblical Israel. It was never part of Israel. In the Second Commonwealth, we're going to see it does become part of Israel, but definitely in this time period is not part of Israel. So I'm going to throw this map into the chat box for anyone who wants to follow it on their own. But that gives us an idea of the areas we're talking about tonight. Just grab the link here, and we will refer back to this, and we'll bring it back up on screen share again later as well. But anyways, that's what we're talking about. And so Yehoachaz is tormented by Ashur. His son then takes over, whose name is Yehoash, the second Yehoash this time. And Yehoash actually starts to reconquer some of the lands that his father lost at the hands of Ashur. So during his father's kingdom, we see that the northern kingdom is chiseled away at through the neighbors, and Yehoash starts to gain a little bit of that back. Okay. Now, if we skip down to Judah, to the southern kingdom, we have a king at this time named Amaziah. Now, Amaziah makes he's a decent king, but he makes one fateful error. And that is that he sees that the northern kingdom is being attacked by its enemies, and therefore he tries to conquer the northern kingdom. He actually wages war against the northern kingdom, tries to capture the northern kingdom. Now, the only problem was the prophet told him he shouldn't do it. He didn't listen to the prophet, right? And so what happens is he ends up failing in battle, and he gets killed by the northern kingdom. So wasn't such a smart idea, was an attempt to reconstitute the original country, but was not a successful attempt. And in the end, he not only lost the war, but he loses his life. Now, it's one of the things that we're going to see happens at this time period as the northern kingdom really starts to unravel, as there's all kinds of alliances that with these different players. Again, the five players on the table are the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So Israel and Judah, as we call them. Aram and Assyria, Aram and Ashur, which is Syria and we'll call it Lebanon, and then Egypt. And the whole story of the next, really the destruction of the northern kingdom, the destruction of the southern kingdom, is really a story of political alliances. Right? Sound familiar? That's what World War I was all about, and that's a lot of what we see going on here. It's going to be this one and that one against this one and that one, and that's going to be where a lot of these challenges are going to come from. Okay, so talking just about as we move chronologically here through our kings in the south after Amaziah. We have a king who's first referred to by the prophet as Uzziyahu, and then his name is changed to Azariah. And he rules for 52 years, pretty decent king, but eventually he gets into a fight with the Kohanim, a fight with the priest, and thinks because he's a king, he should be able to work in the temple, and he brings the Ketores, the incense offering in the temple, and at that point, another case of Artsaraz, or leprosy, he gets leprosy, and therefore has to leave the temple, and he's never able to be healed from that. But what's interesting about Uzziah / Azariah is he is one of the first people who starts to conquer parts of the south, meaning south of the kingdom, the south of what we call modern day Israel. And he's the first Jew that we know of to actually conquer the port city of Eilat. So this is the first time Eilat will come under Jewish rule. We're going to see during most of the Second Temple, it is under Jewish rule. But this is the first time the city of Eilat comes under Jewish rule. Now, interestingly enough, is when we talk about these different lands that were not biblically part of Israel, but were conquered by Israel at different points, either the first Commonwealth, the second Commonwealth, what is the status of these places? Are they Israel or are they not Israel? And what's the practical difference? The practical difference is whether or not the agricultural laws apply in that area. In other words, there's a lot of different laws, mostly agricultural, but even some beyond that, a lot of laws in the Torah that only apply to the land of Israel. Tithing, the gifts to the Kohanim, all these agricultural laws, Shvis, the Shemitah, the sabbatical year, all of these only apply in the land of Israel. So the question is, if the conquering of these lands makes them biblically part of Israel or not. Now, one area which we know for sure does not have that status is Eilat. In other words, the modern day rabbinical authorities are pretty clear that Eilat is not biblically part of Israel. Therefore, the agricultural laws do not apply to Eilat. But a lot of these other countries, like modern day Jordan, which we see it was part of Israel at this time, that's a big question. That's a big question if that is part of quote unquote biblical Israel or not. Okay. So back to the north for a minute. In the north, we're holding by the year 646 before the Common Era. And now we have a king by the name of Yerovam II, which is very interesting because as we talked about in the past few sessions, Yerovam was known as a terrible king. He was the one who was the first king of the northern kingdom. He's the one who built the temples with the golden calves. He's the one who really brings idol worship into the northern kingdom. And now that we many generations later have we're roughly at this point 500 years. No, we're roughly 200 years after the original Yerovam. And clearly, if the king's name is now Yerovam, he's not a direct descendant, but it must be he was named after the original Yerovam. So it goes to show you just an interesting thing about how anytime we study history, or in this case, biblical history, we have to remember that we are looking at it with hindsight. We're looking at it, hindsight's always 20/20, as they say. And we know Yerovam's evil because we have the prophet who told us he's evil. We have our sages who told us he was evil. But it doesn't mean that in his time that he was realized or recognized as an evil person. And for sure not in the kingdom of Israel, right? He was the founding father. He was the George Washington of the northern kingdom. So it would make sense that you would have people, not only his descendants, named after him. And that's the case with this Yerovam II, who is the last of the house of Yehu in the north. And he, in his 38 years as king, he is going to further expand the borders of the northern kingdom, going into Aram. And eventually he's going to be successful in war with Aram. But in the end, Aram being Syria, is going to capture him, kill him. And that's going to be the end of Yerovam II. It's at this time, speaking about prophecy, it's at this time when probably the most famous of prophets of this time begins his career, and that is the prophet Yeshaya, Isaiah. Now, Isaiah is the nephew of Amaziah, who we mentioned before, the king, and Isaiah has a very long career. A very, very long career and a very rough career. We're going to see what ends up happening to him. But let's go ahead and we're going to now finish up the story of the north, and we'll talk more about Isaiah next time, because Isaiah is really a story of the south. He's really a prophet to the southern kingdom, and we're going to talk more about him. So what we see happen now in the roughly 30 years, 40 years that's left of the northern kingdom is quite often is what happens is monarchies start to crumble and kingdoms start to fall apart, and you have all these regional skirmishes going on. We see that there are kings, just one king after another. There's assassinations, internal fighting, and no one leaves for very long. And that's what we see happen now. That after the house of Yehu falls, we have Zechariah. Again, a lot of Zechariahs. This is our second Zechariah mentioning, and next week we'll talk about, or probably in 2 weeks, we'll talk about a third Zechariah, or 2 sessions from now. So Zechariah is a king in Israel, rules for 6 months. He is killed by Shalom, who was not a man of peace by any way, shape, or form. Shalom kills Zechariah, becomes a king for a month, 30 days, and then he is killed by Menachem ben Gadi. And Menachem ben Gadi manages to stay on the throne for 10 years. And not only that, but his progeny takes the throne after him, and his son, Pekachia, takes over after he rules for 2 years, until he is eventually killed by Pekach ben Remaliahu. And Pekach ben Remaliahu is killed by Hoshea ben Elah. So that's what we see, and that's really the list of the last 5 kings or so of the Northern Kingdom. And it's like one assassination. There's one person who wasn't assassinated there, but it's like one assassination after the other to set the tone, so to speak, for the destruction of the Northern Kingdom. Okay. Let's set the stage for the final demise of this kingdom. So in order to set the stage properly, we have to go back to the regional alliances that were happening at this time. And we got to go back to the south for a moment. So in the south, we have a king named Yotam. We don't know much about him, rules for 16 years, and his son is Achaz. So Achaz is a wicked king, and he rules for a total of 16 years. And we're going to see what he does that's so terrible. So in the regional struggles that are going on, he makes an alliance with Syria, with Aram. And in that alliance, he makes an alliance with Ashur, with Assyria. And the alliance is that Assyria will fight against both Aram and Israel, the northern kingdom, on his behalf. Okay? So basically, and this is going to be a fatal error of many Jewish leaders throughout Jewish history. Basically, what Achaz does is he goes to Ashur. He asks them to intercede in his wars on his behalf, to fight Aram, to fight Israel. So they're more than happy to come do it. But the leader at this point of Ashur is somebody by the name of Tiglath-Pileser, who actually who Tanakh gives him 3 different names. The first name is Tiglath-Pileser, the second name is Shalmaneser, and the third name that we really know him by is Sancheriv. This is the great Assyrian emperor Sancheriv, who we accredit with wiping out the northern kingdom. We accredit with many other conquests on the map of world history. And more importantly, I think for a lot of long-term ramifications over here, besides the destruction and loss of the 10 northern tribes, is he had a strategy, really a defensive strategy after he would conquer lands. And what was that? After he would conquer land, he would displace the indigenous people. So if he would conquer one place, he would take the indigenous people, he would move them to another place, and then take other people and put them in their lands. Now, why was that a smart defensive measure? Because he's basically destroying the home field advantage. There's many wars where we know that the indigenous people have an advantage and that they know the terrain. When we talk about, let's say, the Revolutionary War here in America, part of the advantage, really the only advantage besides having a revolutionary cause, but the only advantage that the fledgling Continental Army, which became the United States Army, had was they knew the terrain. Right? They knew the terrain, and the British didn't. And they were able to employ many guerrilla warfare tactics because they knew the terrain, and therefore they could be successful. And we're going to see that Vietnam, that was the story, and in many wars, when you're fighting in enemy territory, you're dealing with home field advantage. So Sancheriv's defensive strategy was to displace people, to take away the home field advantage. That has many ramifications that we're going to talk about, but we'll just introduce it as we introduce Sancheriv. So back to Achaz. So Achaz makes an alliance with Sancheriv against Aram and against Israel. Now, Sancheriv at this point will wipe out Aram and basically conquer that as part of the Assyrian Empire. And we'll see here that he has a lot of success against the northern kingdom. So in our first introduction to Assyria, and this first time he comes to the northern kingdom, we see that he is successful in exiling the first 2.5 of the 10 tribes. So that's going to be, we're going to say it's a process here. It's not like that there's one day Sennacherib comes in, wipes them all out. It's going to be a process that takes several decades. So in 578, he comes in, he wipes out the tribes of Gad, Reuven, and half the tribe of Manasseh. Now, those tribes might sound familiar to you because those were the 2.5 tribes that lived on the other side of the Jordan River. Again, we'll go back to our map here for a moment. So this is where they lived over here. They lived in this area that we call in Hebrew Aver Yarden, or you might want to call it the Jordan Plains. This is where they lived. So when Sennacherib comes in and attacks Aram and attacks Israel, the first thing he conquers, so to speak, as part of his empire, because he's wiped these guys out and absorbed them. Now he takes these guys too and absorbs them. So we see that these tribes that lived in the Jordan and the other side of the Jordan River and modern day Jordan, Transjordan, whatever we call it, they were the first ones to be exiled. Now it's interesting just to point out that up until this time, it's part of Israel. We see that when the British Mandate takes place in 1917, the modern day Jordan, Transjordan, is part of the British Mandate that is seemingly promised to Israel. And so it seems like initially when we're talking about the borders of modern day Israel, modern day Jordan is considered part of that. But the British do a very quick about face on that, much quicker than the about face that they eventually do on the whole Balfour Declaration. But they do an about face and eventually give that to the Hashemite Empire and form the country of Jordan, the kingdom, the Hashemite Empire of Jordan, with King Hussein. Now, but it did have, from a biblical perspective, it had its roots in being part of biblical Israel. But this is when it ceases to happen. Those tribes are wiped out at this time period. Now, what happens is from this point is when Sennacherib came to the northern kingdom and wipes out Gad, Reuven, and Manasseh, there's a man who's not so happy about that, and that is none other than Hoshea ben Elah. So Hoshea ben Elah is upset because he is actually from the tribe of Reuven, and he's upset with Pekach ben Remaliahu, who was the king, because he thinks he just gave in to Sennacherib. So that's why he assassinates him and then takes over his throne. And now we're going to see a back and forth. We're going to see that Sennacherib comes a couple times. Essentially, Hoshea ben Elah is a vassal state to the Assyrian Empire. He's only put there as a puppet king, and as long as he sticks with Syria, so to speak, he's allowed to exist somewhat as a kingdom as long as he pays a tribute. To try and seal that relationship, Sennacherib takes 2 more tribes into exile. He takes the tribe of Zevulun and the tribe of Naphtali into exile. So if you're doing your math, that's 5.5 gone, 4.5 left. And eventually what will happen is that Hoshea will rebel against Sennacherib, and then Sennacherib will come back, put down the rebellion, and he'll exile. I put in the outline 2.5. I meant it was 4.5. He'll come back and he'll exile the final 4.5 of the 10 northern tribes, making them henceforth the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Now, before we stop talking about Hoshea, there is one good thing that he did, and that is that we referred before to the centuries that Yeravam ben Nevat had put on the road to Jerusalem, preventing Jews from going to Jerusalem. Hoshea removes them. He's the first king. He's the last king, but he's the first king of Israel that makes it permissible for the Jews of the northern kingdom to visit Jerusalem, to go to the temple. No one takes advantage of it, right? It's insignificant at this time period. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the 10 tribes. So we see this was a process of Sennacherib slowly chiseling away at the northern kingdom until he totally takes it over, and through his defensive strategy, displaces the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom to other places in the Assyrian Empire. Now, You probably heard all kinds of folklore about the 10 tribes, 10 lost tribes. You heard them referred to as the 10 lost tribes throughout your life. And the concept that is often thrown around is a Kabbalistic concept. And that is that in Kabbalistic literature, it says that Sancheriv exiled the 10 northern tribes to an area behind a river, a mystical river called the River Samaritan, which spits out rocks 6 days a week, making it impossible to traverse. And it rests on Shabbos, but you can't cross the river on Shabbos. So that's how the 10 tribes have stayed lost all this time. And throughout Jewish history, there's been many interesting phenomena. First of all, explorers looking for the river Samaritan, looking for the 10 lost tribes, expecting to find them somehow intact in some distant land. And every time we have different elements of the Jewish people that seem to have been severed and returned, one famous one is the Beta Israel community in Ethiopia, and then individuals throughout history who've claimed to be from the 10 lost tribes. But quite often there's a claim, oh, they're from the 10 lost tribes. That's how they got there. And the theory is almost always debunked. And that is because if we do a careful study of Tanakh, of the Jewish Bible, together with our sages, we understand exactly what happened to these 10 tribes. The majority of them were lost completely, 100%, forever, because they were displaced. They were put into the Assyrian Empire, and within 2 generations, they were completely assimilated and lost. They did not set up shuls and kolos and communities and pizza shops. They didn't do any of that. Within 2 generations, gone from the Jewish people. That is what happens to probably the majority of the 10 tribes. So what's the basis then for this Kabbalistic idea that they're still there, that they're lost, they're coming back? What's the basis for that? Quite simply, it's the prophet Jeremiah, who we haven't gotten to yet. We're gonna talk about him next time. But Jeremiah has a prophecy, which also is in our liturgy for the high holidays. So we're getting a lot of hits on the high holidays tonight. And that is, we say the words in the repetition of the Musaf on Rosh Hashanah, just a few days from now. We say, Uva Ovdim be'eretz Ashur ve'hanidachim be'eretz Mitzrayim. That we say, as Jeremiah, quoting the prophecy of Jeremiah, that there will be a time in the future, seemingly referring to the Messianic era, where the people who were exiled to Egypt will return, and those who were thrown away by the lands into the lands of Ashur, the lands of Assyria, they will also return to Yerushalayim. And this is a great song if you like Jewish music. There's a great tune to it. But anyways, part of our high holiday liturgy, part of the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, the prophecy of Jeremiah that seemingly in the Messianic era, that those expelled to the Assyrian Empire will return and be part of the Jewish people. That's the basis for this Kabbalistic idea. But if we look at it practically, what really happens? We're a little ahead of ourselves. We'll talk about this more later, but the prophet Jeremiah, under his time as the prophet, the leader of the Jewish people, one thing that he makes great effort to do, first before the destruction of the temple and the destruction of the southern kingdom, and then even more so afterwards when he eventually goes to Babylon, is he works very hard to go around and find the remnants of the 10 tribes. And the Talmud says that he finds possibly up to 30,000 of the remnants of the 10 lost tribes, the 10 northern tribes, and he brings them together with the community, first in Judah and then in Babylon during the Babylonian exile. Not only this, but we understand from our sages that there were many who defected from the northern kingdom, especially in the end, who defected down to the southern kingdom, to Judah. So practically what it means is, we talk about nowadays is we have no tribal affiliation. Unless we are a Kohen or a Levi, we basically have no clue what tribe we came from. There are some exceptions to this. There are some people, if you're familiar with the great Twersky family, the great Hasidic dynasty, there was Rabbi Abraham Twersky, who was a very prolific writer and psychiatrist. There's the Twerskys in Milwaukee, there's Twerskys in Denver. They're all part of the same Hasidic dynasty. They have a family tree which shows that they go back to King David. Okay. Some people have such a thing, but most of us don't. Most of us, if we're not a Kohen or a Levi, we just assume we're a Shlishi or a Yisrael, right? We assume that we're just a plain old Jew. Now, that doesn't mean that we're from Judah, right? Because the southern kingdom was the kingdom of Judah because it was mainly the tribe of Judah. But first of all, it was also the tribe of Benjamin. And not only that, we see from our discussion tonight that there are many elements of the other 10 tribes that became part of the remnant that was Judah, that goes into the Babylonian exile, that comes back to the Second Temple, that goes to the Jewish world, and that we are today. So nowadays, we could be from any of those 12 tribes. We could be. We very possibly are from any of the 12 tribes. Now, majority does rule, and the majority of our antecedents, if we're alive today, is the tribe of Judah. But still, there were definitely, like we said, up to 30,000 from the other 10 tribes. And by the way, in a country that was, I think we assume about up to 4 million people possibly at this time. So not a big number, not a big percentage, but definitely there. So majority rules, and most of us come from the tribe of Judah, but there's a chance that we come from the other 10. And therefore, when we talk about this prophecy of the Messianic era of the 10 tribes being reinstated, what we understand is they will be reinstated from the remnant that Jeremiah the prophet saved. So the idea that there's some 10 tribes out there hiding, River Sambatyon, again, what it means Kabbalistically, I'm not a Kabbalist, so I can't tell you. You have to hire a Kabbalist for that. It's beyond my pay grade. But at least how I understand it as a Barstool historian and a wannabe biblical scholar is that the 10 tribes were never completely lost. Most of them, yes. Most of them are completely assimilated within the Assyrian Empire within 2 generations and are gone. And that's the predominant opinion of the Talmud. But there were up to 30,000 of them that became part of the southern kingdom, part of the kingdom of Judah. And therefore, when we talk about the Messianic era and all 12 tribes being reinstated, it is going to be from the remnant that we still have today mixed up within all of us. And with that ends the Northern Kingdom. The Northern Kingdom is now completely controlled by Assyria, by Sennacherib. And what does Sennacherib naturally do at this point? He's going to turn his attentions on the south. Now, you might think that's kind of funny. I mean, who was it who invited Sennacherib into Israel to begin with? It was the south, right? We said that Achaz invited Sennacherib, made an alliance with them. Now that Sennacherib has wiped out the northern kingdom, he comes and turns his attention and tries to conquer the southern kingdom. You know, it's like you invite the bear for dinner and he decides to stay for lunch, which again is going to be a trend of Jewish history. How do you think the Romans get into Israel, who eventually destroy the Second Temple? They're invited in by the Maccabees to help defend against the Greeks. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. But, you know, never invite the bear for dinner because he'll just decide to stay for lunch. Or invite him for lunch, he'll decide to stay for dinner. Because that's what's going to happen with Sennacherib. Okay, we'll get to that next time as we talk about his attempted conquest of the south and the demise eventually after that of the southern kingdom. One last point to wrap us up tonight about the northern kingdom. We mentioned that Sennacherib displaces people. We mentioned that he put the Jews elsewhere in his empire. What's he do with the land then? Who's he put in his place? So Sennacherib now takes the people from a country called Kuth or Kutha. In English, we call it Crete, part of the Greek Isles, the Greek islands. And he brings people from Crete and he puts them into the northern kingdom. These people throughout the Talmud are referred to quite often as the Kusim because they come from Crete or Kuth in Hebrew. And they also take on another name. And that is they take on the name Shomronim. Now, why do they take on the name Shomronim? Because Shomron was the capital of the northern kingdom, which they now possess. And quite often, the whole country was referred to not as Israel, but as Shomron. It became another name for the kingdom, kind of like we refer to, you know, Babylon and Babylonia. Like one's the capital, one's the country. Similar over here, it was Shomron in Israel, and they were sort of interchangeable in antiquity. So the people, the Cretes, the Kusim, who are put into the northern kingdom, are also referred to by the name Shomronim, or in English, Samaritans. If you ever wonder where the Samaritans come from, that's where they come from. Samaria is English for Shomron. And therefore, these people are put into Israel are not so good friends, the Samaritans. Now, there's a general principle. We'll talk about it more when we get to the early Christians. But if somebody in the Christian Bible is referred to as good, it usually means they're really bad. And if someone's referred to as bad, it usually means they're really good. For example, I'll challenge all of you when we're done tonight, or if you want to now, you can multitask, to Google the word Pharisee and look at what the translation is. quite often, the first translation you'll be given is the accurate one, that they are the rabbis of the Talmud, they're the rabbis from the Second Temple, they're very pious rabbis, very pious people, whatever somewhat accurate definition you will find. But inevitably, the second definition is always something more like serpent, sly, deceiving person. And that's because in the Christian Bible, the Pharisees are referred to as sly, deceptive, terrible people. They sold out Yashka, and they were Yashka's enemies, and they didn't accept him. And they're the reasons the Jews didn't accept him. They misled the Jews, and they're terrible, terrible people. Now, the English word's Pharisee. In Hebrew, we call them the Perushim. And more specifically, we call them Hillel, Shammai, Rebbe Akiva, Rebbe Yehuda, and Nasi. They are rabbis, right? The rabbis of the Talmud are who are referred to in the Christian Bible as Pharisees, and you can look up in your dictionary and see a terrible definition. And they are our rabbis. They are our leaders. They are the ones who, because of them, we are here today. Along those lines is the Samaritans. The Samaritans are referred to in the Christian Bible as the Good Samaritan because of the story, if you know your Christian Bible, that the Pharisee saw a man along the road and he wouldn't help him, and the priest saw the man along the road and he thought about helping him but didn't help him, and finally the Samaritan comes along and he helps him because the Samaritans are great and the priests are terrible and the Pharisees are terrible, right? In other words, the Kohanim and Rebbe Akiva and Hillel, terrible according to the Christians, right? So therefore, our Samaritan becomes referred to as the Good Samaritan. Now, really, why did the Christians like the Samaritans? Because of what happens now. The Samaritans, the Kusim are put into the northern kingdom of Israel, and they set up shop. And it's their home. And they're there roughly from the year 574 or 556, so it was a 550 round up until about 350, when the Jews are allowed to come back to build the Second Commonwealth. So 200 years. And 200 years, they become pretty comfortable. And they think it's their homeland. And what do you think happens when the Jews come back and they say, we're here to reclaim our ancestral homeland? The Samaritans are going to say, no, you aren't. And they're going to challenge them and fight them to where we see Ezra describe that as they rebuilt the Second Temple, they had to do it with a hammer and a chisel in one hand and a sword in the other, as they had to fight with the Samaritans, who challenged them and tried to thwart them every single way. Whoever was threatening the Jewish people, the Samaritans were there to align themselves with the threat, and not the least of which is the Christians. Once the Christians come along, the Samaritans are very happy to ally themselves with the Christians, therefore becoming the Good Samaritans, because they are willing to help fight the Jews against the attempt of Christians to take over the world. So as I like to refer to them, they are the not so good Samaritans, right? There's nothing good about them. And if you live in Cincinnati, we have a couple of people here from Cincinnati tonight. That hospital, Good Sam, I always refer to it as not so good Sam. And even though it's a good hospital, I guess, but maybe it is, maybe it's not. But it is that from a Jewish perspective, there's nothing good about the Samaritans. So we always have to be careful, you know, as I often quote, the number one rule of debate is not to use the language of your opponent, because once you use the language of your opponent, you're conceding a point. And therefore, if we're referring to the Samaritans as good, that means that what was good about them, that they tried to wipe the Jews out at the beginning of the Second Commonwealth, and they allied themselves with the Christians in that regard, meaning at the end of the Second Commonwealth, and therefore they're good. We don't want to call them that. Along these lines, I see there's a question. We'll get to questions in a moment. But along these lines is this area in general, and we'll fast forward a little bit in history. But you probably at least once in your life have heard the terminology Yehuda and Shomron, or Judea and Samaria. Now, when we talk about that in modern vernacular and the modern Jewish vernacular, so to speak, we're referring to what for lack of a better way of saying it, the other side refers to as the West Bank. The West Bank of the Jordan River, we refer to as Yehuda and Shomron, as Judah and Samaria, as Judea and Samaria. Now, why don't we call it the West Bank? Because, again, that would be conceding a point to our opponent. Calling it the West Bank implies it's the West Bank of the East Bank of the Arab Empire, and has nothing to do with the Jews. And therefore, from the times of Begin, it was often referred to as Judea and Samaria, as sort of the ancestral name of the area. And by the way, that also came from the Balfour Declaration, which the Balfour Declaration made reference to the area as Judea and Samaria. Now, it's not really an accurate term, because as you know by now, as everything, even if you're just paying attention tonight and you haven't been to any of our previous sessions, what was Judea or Judah? That was the whole southern kingdom, right? If we go back to our map for a minute, let's pull the map back up. When we talk about Judea or Judah, we are talking about, this whole area here, right? Everything, let me get my fancy marker here. Everything south, right? This is Judea, so to speak, Judea, right? And what's Samaria? Shomron? That's this. So, my friends, that is not what we are talking about when we talk about, I have another picture here that I'll bring up for you. That's not what we're talking about. All right, I'm not get those drawings off. I'm sorry. But that's not what we're talking about when we talk about, I thought I had it here, a picture of modern day Israel. I guess I don't have it, but maybe I do. Anyways, if you look at a map of modern day Israel, when they the quote unquote West Bank is a lot smaller than that area. The whole country was Judea and Samaria at this time. So it's just a funny terminology. The whether we call it the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, neither is accurate because it's really just part of it was ancestrally Judah. Everything south of Jerusalem is Judah, and everything north of Jerusalem was Shomron or Samaria. But it's only one part of it. So that was what Begin's thing was, to start referring to that to show its Jewish roots. But we'll talk to that when we get to modern Jewish history. But be it as it may, for our discussion here, that the people who are put into the country are the Samaritans, the Kusim, the Shomronim, all the same people. They are a thorn in the side of the Jews for the whole time we have to interact with them until they're eventually wiped out, and there is nothing good about them. One last thing about the Samaritans, and then we'll conclude and open up to any questions we might have. The Talmud describes that the Samaritans, after taking over the land or being given the land, had to deal with a formidable foe. The formidable foe was the lions. Now, lions are not indigenous to the land of Israel, but there was some sort of miraculous situation where the Kutim, the Shomronim, kept being attacked by lions. They figured the reason they were being attacked by lions was because they were not observing the religion that was indigenous to the land. They weren't respecting the gods of the land, so to speak. So they therefore converted to Judaism during that time. And the Talmud refers to them as Giarei Arias, which means lion converts, because they were basically forced to convert by the lions. And as we've mentioned many times before, and we'll talk about many times again, that somebody who converts for ulterior motives, their conversion is good, but they're on probation. They're suspect. This is what we talked about with Ruth, if you remember. This is what we talked about with Orpah. This is what we talked about with Jezebel. All of these converts throughout history, that if there's an ulterior motive, the conversion's good, but they're on probation. And if they lapse in their Judaism, the conversion is retroactively null and void. And that is what happens with our Samaritans, that they do convert to Judaism because of the lions, but ultimately, through their actions during the Second Temple, they show that they are not sincere Jews, and therefore today, we definitely do not consider the Samaritans Jewish. There are a remnant, supposedly, of the Samaritans who do meet in the city of Shomron and bring a Passover offering every year. You can Google them, very interesting people, but there's no thought whatsoever that they are authentic Jews or that anything that they are doing is authentic Judaism. And that's our friends. With friends like this, you don't need enemies, but our friends, the not so good Samaritans. I thank you all for coming. I thank you for listening. We are off the next month because of the holidays. Next Tuesday night's Rosh Hashanah. The following Tuesday night's Yom Kippur. The following Tuesday night is Sukkot. The following Tuesday night is Shmini Atzeres. And then after that marathon of Jewish holidays, we will continue with the destruction of the Southern Kingdom. More happy occasions. And but more than happy to stick around and answer questions as long as you got them. I thank you all for coming. I thank you for listening. So any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask your questions.
Yasher Koyach, Rabbi. Always excellent.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate it. Gary, did I hear you say you're in Cleveland right now?
I'm in Cleveland for a few days, yes.
And you don't even call anymore. You know, you don't bring me flowers anymore, Gary.
Where are you?
I'm in Cleveland. I'm right down the street.
All right, maybe we can have a few days.
Let's get together for something. I'll text you offline and we'll see if we can get together while you're here. So, okay, any other question?
I have a question about the lions.
Yeah, go for it, Joanne. That's Joanne, right? Yeah.
Sorry. I'm like making
no worries,
a Rosh Hashanah challah for non-Jewish clients right now. So anyway.
I love it.
So even though lions aren't indigenous to Israel, could it have been it was written as a lions and it was symbolic Aren't lions supposed to be a symbolism of justness and justice?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So could it have been like they realized that they needed to go back to the ideals of justice that come from Judaism?
Very interesting idea. I never thought about it before. In other words, when our sages tell us that they were being eaten by lions, I'm going to expand your idea, and you'll tell me if I'm on par or not, on the ball or not. That we know that the land of Israel has never sprouted for any of its captors, never sprouted for any other nation that's controlled it. Which is one of the reasons why no one's ever had a capital there besides the Jewish people, because no one's been able to do anything with the land but us. So you could say that they were dying from the lions. In other words, dying because there's a special covenant between the Jewish people and the land of Israel that it'll only thrive for us. They realized that, and therefore that's the lion's covenant, so to speak, and therefore wanted to convert to Judaism. I'll take the point a step forward, that one of the symbolism of the lion of Judaism comes from a couple places. First of all, if we look at Bilam's curse turned blessing, one of the blessings are that Hein Am Kilavi Yakum Kariyas Nasa, that this is the nation that's poised like a lion, right? Bilam refers to us as a lion nation. And then when we talk about more Kabbalistic literature, we see that that on the chariot of the Almighty, the right side of the chariot, representing his strong side, is a lion's image, as if like along the lines we were saying, justice, the strong side. And I take it a step further, that when we talk about the strong side of Hashem, we're often talking about open miracles. And so they wanted that open miracle of the relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel, and represented by the strong side of Hashem. I don't know. Interesting idea. I never thought about it before. Very interesting.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions before we wrap it up? Questions, comments, concerns, good jokes, bad jokes, anything you want to share? Okay. Well, again, I want to wish everybody a kasiva v'chasima tova. Everyone should be written and sealed in the book of life for good, for health, for happiness, for amazing things. We should have an amazing year ahead of us. I think we're overdue for an amazing year. And I just want to wish you a good gebenchte year. It should be a good year and a blessed year. And we should all just hear good things and see good things and experience good things. I want to thank you all for learning with us throughout this past year. It's been quite a year, and I look forward to learning with everybody in the coming year, either virtually or in person. When this pandemic eventually comes to an end, as hopefully it will, we plan to continue all of our virtual programs alongside of our live in-person programs. So for those of you who are not here in Cleveland, we can continue together. And I just want to thank you all for coming, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. Good Yom Tov, everybody.
Good Yom Tov, everyone. Rabbi, I enjoy being with you.
Thanks, Gary. It's always a pleasure. I'm going to give you a text so we can get together.
All right.